There are forces of good and forces of evil at work in the world today. What are these forces? Who is responsible for the good? And who is responsible for the evil? Richard Shoff talks about current events which are rarely discussed by the mainstream media, events that affect us all. This program seeks to identify, to inform, and to equip the believer for what's ahead. Welcome to What in the World is Going On?
Good morning, good listeners. This is What in the World is Going On. I'm your host, Richard Shoff. The program is sponsored by Lincoln Log Homes. We are pro-Christian, pro-American, pro-life, pro-Second Amendment, and here by the grace of God. This morning, folks, we're going to talk a little bit about what happened behind the headlines on a current events situation. We're going to talk about the Mueller fiasco. The Republicans were aware of Mueller's frailty ahead of the hearing. I wondered about that. I did not hear the first session. I heard the second, and it didn't take me long to realize something was wrong. Robert Mueller was having problems. Then it became, was he not prepared, or God forbid, was he senile? Something appeared wrong to me right from the get-go. When he testified before the House Intelligence Committee hearing on his report on the Russian election, it was evident that there was not everything right. Republicans are expected the former special counsel's feeble testimony, and some even strategized around it as they prepared their questions. This according to Representative Matt Gaetz. That was one of the things I first questioned. Did anybody know about it? And if they did they think this was going to be such a great threat to anybody or solution to any problems? A day after Mueller's appearance before Congress, described by some as befuddled and others as a disaster for Democrats, Matt Gaetz, the Florida Republican, said the 74-year-old prosecutor's health was a hot topic in prep sessions. There were some House Republicans in our prep sessions patting themselves on the back about that and feeling optimistic about assertions that he might not be all there. Gaetz reported this to the Washington Times. Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Lindsey Graham, a South Carolina Republican, wasn't part of the questioning of Mr. Mueller, but he said he was aware of the lawyer's frail condition ahead of the hearing. I know he was in a weakened condition, Graham told the Times. He said the Democrats never should have pressured Mr. Mueller to testify given that condition. He pointed out, rightly I agree, that Mueller's a great American. He's a patriot. He was wounded in Vietnam. He served as the FBI director after 9/11. Graham said he was very upset that Democrats would put him up in that kind of a spot. It was clear to me, Graham said, based on common friends' comment, that he was in a weakened condition. And what happened was really over the top. He was, Senator Graham said, a great American. Many Democrats had hoped Mr. Mueller would seal the cause for impeachment against President Trump with commercial-ready sound bites about corruption and the obstruction of justice. Instead, the former FBI director and prosecutor stumbled over his lines. He seemed unfamiliar with his own 448-page report and repeatedly had to be guided by his questionnaires. Representative Steve Cobbett, an Ohio Republican, who questioned Mueller in his morning appearance before the House Judiciary Committee, said Thursday that he wasn't aware of the conversations regarding Mr. Mueller's health. I'm not saying it didn't come up, he said, but I didn't hear anything about it. He was surprised that Mr. Mueller struggled to answer a question about Fusion GPS. That was a company paid by the Democrat National Committee and the Hillary Clinton campaign to conduct opposition research on Mr. Trump. Fusion's GPS paid Christopher Steele, the former British spy who compiled a salacious and largely unproven disaster dossier that fueled much of the Trump-Russia speculation around the 2016 election. We've all heard of Fusion GPS, yet Mueller was shocked he didn't know what it was. He said he wasn't familiar with Fusion's GPS, even though it was mentioned in his own report. Representative Doug Collins of Georgia, the top Republican on the House Judiciary Committee, denied that knowledge of Mr. Mueller's health played a part in his party's preparations for the session. We were just told he'd come in and answer questions, Mr. Collins said. My concern to my committee was no matter how he comes in, we're going to ask a question very direct and very affirmatively, and that's what we talked about. Collins said the panel wasn't sure what to expect because Mr. Mueller had stayed out of public eye while running his 22-month investigation into the Russian election meddling. Beyond the former special counsel's brief press statement in May, his committee had nothing to go on, he told the Times. And that, to me personally, folks, was a shock. I can't imagine that he wasn't talking to somebody. Wasn't he talking to Trump's attorneys? Apparently not. Collins also had a different take on Mueller's performance. He suggested that those who viewed Mueller as frail were Democrats trying to compensate for not getting the political dynamite that they'd hoped that it would be able to provide them. Well, it didn't work at all. They didn't get anything. But, of course, they're still going to talk about impeachment. Anyway, Representative Jamie Raskin, a Maryland Democrat, said he hadn't heard the rumors of Mueller's frailty and that it was not an issue during the Democrats' hearing preparation. But he conceded that the former special counsel's performance was uneven and likely the result of his age. He said, and I quote, "It reminds me that the fastest growing demographic in America is older Americans. This is something all of us are dealing with in our own families." Another Democrat, Peter DeFazio of Oregon, also found Mr. Mueller's performance to be lacking. Here are some of the comments that I heard after Mueller appeared before the two committees. I think I heard him on Sean Hannity at 1 in the morning. That's where I get most of my best stuff. Anyway, comments heard after after Mueller's appearance. Senator Graham said Mueller did not write the report bearing his name. He was totally uninformed as to its content. Mark Levine said, quote, "No condition to testify," end quote. Laura Ingraham said Mueller did not write the report, and he was not in charge of it. She also noted, quoting, "Trump beats the elites again." Incidentally, Mueller is a personal friend, both ways, with A.G. Barr, and Barr had tried to give Mueller an out so that he wouldn't have to testify. But it didn't work. He did testify. Now it's history. Another report on the same subject, titled What We Learned from the Mueller's Hearing. There were a couple of volumes that contained in the 448 pages that the investigation did not find sufficient evidence that the Trump campaign coordinated or conspired with the Russian government and did not pursue charges against the president. On Wednesday, July 24th, 2019, Mueller testified before the House Judiciary Intelligence Committee and submitted about 8 hours of questioning regarding his report of almost 2 years' investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 elections and related matters. In a nutshell, here's what we learned. First, Mueller did not check his staff. Which consistently mainly in Hillary Clinton people. He didn't check the staff for their conflicts of interest in order to avoid bias in the investigation. Next, Mueller did not know or was not familiar with Fusion GPS, Steele dossier. That was all over the place. The Democrat National Committee and the Clinton campaign paying for it. That was the original source of the information that sparked his appointment and the report. Next, he was not threatened to be fired by the president, and there was no White House interference during his investigation. His assistants were more familiar with the report, making him a figurehead. He could not legally justify the non-exoneration of the president, since prosecutors do not exonerate, but only prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. This is how some of the Democrats summarized the hearing in their own words. David Axelrod on Twitter, "This is very, very painful." Chuck Todd on NBC, "On optics, this was a disaster." Michael Moore on Twitter, "A frail old man, unable to remember things, stumbling, refusing to answer basic questions." Compared with other investigations related to the Nixon tapes, Iran-Contra, Clinton impeachment, the Mueller hearings appears to be a pathetic witch hunt disguised as an investigation. Actually, this should have been the day that the impeachment talk died, but it wasn't. Attorney General William Barr will now get ready to investigate the investigators. The counter-investigation should get to the bottom of the Russia collusion delusion and to the real players of this whole wicked scheme. Who are they? Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and their henchmen. I'll have a bit more later on the program today on the subject. And then this. William Marshall noted, quote, "It's time to wheel Robert Mueller away." How did a man in such a sorry state of such self-evident mental decline get appointed to head up one of the most significant investigations in American law enforcement history? That's the question one would be forgiven for asking, watching Robert Mueller's testimony before the House Judiciary Committee regarding his investigation into the alleged collusion between the Trump presidential campaign and Russia. The number of times he said, mouth agape, while direct and straightforward questions were put to him, only to ask that question that he repeated so often. How striking. The question, what was the question? One of Mueller's most often repeated responses. What was the question? The amount of stammering, stumbling, oohs, and ahs were almost embarrassing to watch. Even the Dems were obviously frustrated by Mueller's halting, his timorous responses, especially regarding President Trump's obstruction of the government's investigation. The image wasn't helped when the first Republican to question Mueller, Representative Doug Collins of Georgia, said he would make an extra effort to speak slowly for Mueller's benefit. That kindness didn't seem to help Mueller's comprehension, certainly not based on the times he continued to ask that question be repeated, or the time when he directly contradicted what he'd written in his report, saying that in colloquial terms, and I'm quoting, collusion and conspiracy were not the same thing, whereas his report said they were. Mueller did his best, giving his declining faculties to. He bobbed and he weaved. As Republicans did a great job of putting very reasonable and often biting questions to him. He frequently invoked, quote, that's outside my purview, or I didn't get into that, I can't get into that, or I'll stand by the report. But those invocations only reinforced what was apparent for months, that Mueller was a figurehead who had never effectively run the special counsel investigation and didn't know what his own report, what the contents were. Moreover, it was never really an investigation to begin with. It was an extension of a political destruction operation begun by CIA Director John Brennan and FBI Director James Comey in the spring of '16, when they were working for Hillary Clinton's operatives, and the complicit media by mounting a bogus counterintelligence investigation of Trump and his campaign. After Brennan and Corey were ejected from the government following Trump's election, the ball was then picked up by Mueller's special counsel investigation, which was really run by Andrew Weissman, who by those in the know pretty much all agreed that he's a legal thug of the first order. A popular refrain for many of the representatives, mostly Democrats, but some Republicans, was to thank Mueller for his services as a Marine officer in Vietnam, leading a rifle company and being awarded a Bronze Star with V, and a Purple Heart. Those were truly great acts of heroism and worthy of all of our gratitude as Americans. But the real tragedy is that his service is now diminished by its use as a cynical shield to protect a man who sacrificed his integrity by putting America through an excruciating 2-year-long attack on its president with a politically motivated investigation. That treacherous role far eclipsed Mueller's credible service half a century ago in Southeast Asia. One of the frequently repeated phrases among the priming Democrats in the Mueller hearing applied to President Trump as what? Quote, no one is above the law, end quote. I find this amusing. This is the tagline for Judicial Watch, which has been one of the most effective instruments in Washington for exposing the deep state and the Hillary campaign in their plot to undermine Donald Trump. Those deep staters simply cannot abide the man or the fact that their beloved Hillary Clinton, whom they loved and was destined for the presidency, lost to him. Wheeling out Robert Mueller didn't help their cause. The American people don't favor impeaching the president, with only 27% of Americans supporting impeachment. And Nancy Pelosi certainly doesn't recalling that impeachment caused President Clinton's rise in popularity. This is not to mock a befuddled old man who couldn't remember which president first appointed him to high office. I saw that. Tragic. The point is to illustrate that Robert Mueller no longer had the wits to oversee a true large-scale investigation. And he did not do so in the case of the so-called investigation into Trump-Russia collusion, because it was not an investigation in the first place, and Mueller was not really its head. A tragic ending for a man with a great history. As a follow-up, and this is what I said I'd be mentioning, Trump did give Barr everything he needs to reverse the Russian probe. President Donald Trump says he's given Attorney General William Barr total release to probe the roots of the Russian probe that Trump repeatedly has called a witch hunt. I gave him a total release. In other words, he's got everything, anything he needs, he's got. Trump said that on Fox News to Sean Hannity Thursday night. He is the Attorney General of the United States, but he's got a lot of very good people under him that I guess are involved, and I gave him a total release. So all of it has been released, and he has it all with him. He's got it all. Trump added, and I quote, "I've also given him authorization to release it to whoever he wants." A quote from our president. Trump authorized Barr in May to investigate the Russian probe investigators and their action taken in the wake of Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report. Mueller, a former FBI director, found insufficient evidence that anyone in Trump's team conspired with the Russians to win the 2016 election. He did not make a decision on whether to pursue an obstruction of justice case against Trump, but Barr and then Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein opted not to move forward with the case. Trump and his allies claim that there was a conspiracy within the government, including the FBI, to prevent Donald Trump from serving as president by way of the Russia investigation, the origins of which are not entirely clear, as noted. Multiple FISA warrants were authorized in 2016 and 17, which allowed the FBI to survey some of Trump's advisors. Mueller's Russia probe resulted in several criminal convictions, but folks, none of them were related to conspiring with Russia or obstructing justice. I want to bring this in. It's kind of an appropriate time, I think, for it. It is by a Jack Minzy on the Civil War in the United States today. Jack Minzy professionally was the head of the Department of Education at Eastern Michigan University, as well as a prolific author of numerous books, most of which were on the topic of education and government role therein. He wrote some on the Civil War, and the following is his last work on the Civil War. Jack passed away Sunday, April 8th, 2018. I'm going to read this. It's worthy at this time for us to look at. How do civil wars happen? Two or more sides agree on who runs a country, and then they settle the question through elections, because they don't even agree that elections are how to decide who's in charge. That's the basic issue here. Who decides who runs the country? When you hate each other but accept the election results, you've got a country. When you do not accept the election, you have a deep state dictatorship with federal judges dictating to the president on what he's allowed to do. When you stop accepting election results, you have a countdown to a civil war. The Mueller investigation is about removing President Trump from office and overturning the results of an election. We all know that. But it's not the first time that they've done this. The first time a Republican president was elected in this century, they said he didn't actually win. The Supreme Court gave him the election. There's a pattern here. What do sure odds of the Democrats rejecting the next Republican president really mean? It means that they don't accept the results of any election that they don't win. It means they don't believe that transfers of power in this country are determined by election. That's a civil war. There's no shooting, not unless you count the attempt to kill a bunch of Republicans at a charity baseball game practice. But the Republicans or the Democrats have rejected our system of government. This isn't dissent. It's not disagreement. You can hate the other party. You can think they're the worst thing that ever happened to the country. So you just work a bit harder to win the next election. When you consistently reject the results of elections that you don't win, what you want is a dictatorship. Your very own dictatorship. The only legitimate exercise of power in this country, according to the Democrats, is its own. Whenever Republicans exercise power, it's inherently illegitimate. The Democrats lost Congress. They lost the White House. So what do? They began trying to run the country through federal judges and bureaucrats. Every time that a federal judge issues an order saying that the President of the United States can't scratch his own back without his saying so, that is civil war. Our system of government is based on the Constitution, but that's not the system that runs the country. The Democrat system is that any part of government that it runs gets total and unlimited power over the country. If Democrats are in the White House, then the president can do anything. And I mean anything. He can have his own amnesty for illegal aliens. He can fine you for not having health insurance. His power is unlimited. He is a dictator. But when Republicans get into the White House, suddenly the president cannot do anything. He isn't even allowed to undo the illegal alien amnesty, that one that his predecessor illegally invented. A Democrat in the White House has discretion to completely decide every aspect of immigration policy. A Republican doesn't even have the discretion to reverse him. That's how the game's played now, folks. That's how our country is run. Sad but true, although the left hasn't yet won that particular fight. When a Democrat is in the White House, states aren't even allowed to enforce immigration law. But when a Republican is in the White House, states can create their own immigration laws. Under Obama, a state wasn't allowed to go to the bathroom without asking permission, but under Trump, Jerry Brown can go around saying that California is an independent republic and sign treaties with other countries. The Constitution has something to say about that, folks. And folks, it's not a free country when FBI agents who support Hillary take out a, quote, insurance policy against Trump winning the election. It's not a free country when Obama officials engage in massive unmasking of the opposition. It's not a free country when the media responds to the other guy's winning by trying to ban the conservative media that supported him from social media. And it's not a free country when all of the above collude together to overturn an election because the guy who wasn't supposed to win just did. Have no doubt we're in a civil war between conservative volunteer government and a leftist Democrat professional government. We are there, folks.